name's Brian Hart. I teach history here at Del Mar, and today's lecture is part of the college's celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, and it's also part of the DMC Cultural Programs series, which runs throughout the year and provides a number of opportunities, including discussions and lectures by scholars, historians in this case. Today's discussion is funded by the college and organized by the Cultural Programs Committee, and our guest today is Professor Frank de la Teja, Chair of the History Department and Professor of History at Texas State University in San Marcos. He is also currently the Texas State Historian, and he's the first person to hold that position. He was appointed by Governor Perry last year to a 2-year term as Texas State Historian. Past president of the Texas State Historical Association, member of the development team that came up with the content portion of the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum in Austin, which is really something to see. If you haven't been, it's really worth your time. In other words, he's a pretty high-powered historian here in Texas that we are very pleased and very honored to have with us today. He has published extensively on Texas topics, Texas during the Spanish period, Texas during the Mexican period, and Texas during the period when it was an independent republic. Among the books that he's published are San Antonio de Bejar, a community on New Spain's northern frontier, published by the University of New Mexico Press in 1995. A Revolution Remembered, the memoirs and selected correspondence of Juan N. Seguin. Second edition was 2002, published by the Texas State Historical Association. And co-editor of a book titled Choice, Persuasion, and Coercion, Social Control on Spain's North American Frontiers, University of New Mexico Press in 2005. He has also published articles in a number of scholarly journals, including the Americas, Quarterly Review of Inter-American Cultural History, the Journal of the Early Republic, Historia Mexicana, and the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. A couple of additional things about Professor de la Teja. He worked, when he first arrived at the University of Texas as a graduate student, this would have been in the early 80s. He worked as a research assistant to the novelist James Michener, as Michener was collecting information that went into his novel, Texas, which is a remarkable read if you've never gotten around to it. And I'm assuming that was a really cool experience.
It was.
Yeah, that sounds pretty neat. He's won a number of awards, among them the San Antonio Conservation Society Book Citation, the Republic of Texas Presidio de la Bahia Award, Sons of the Republic of Texas Summerfield G. Roberts Award, and he's also received the Americanism Medal from the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. All right. His topic for us this morning is a Tejano perspective on the Texas Revolution. Would you please welcome Professor Frank de la Teja.
Well, good morning, and I hope you can all hear me back there. Yes? Great. I usually don't have any problems being heard. People might not like what they hear, but at least they hear. And I've also got to, you said back in the early 80s. Oh my God, more than half the people in the room weren't even born. So it's no wonder I have to put these things on, which I didn't have to put on back in the early 80s. Thank you to everyone here at Del Mar College for inviting me to help you celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. And there is much to celebrate, not just in the accomplishments of the recent past, in the struggle for equal rights and opportunities. Those of you who are younger can talk to your parents about that because they were in many ways on the front lines of those struggles. But also of the more distant past, the past where I spend a lot of, or as much time as I possibly can. We need to celebrate those ancestors whose roles in the creation of Texas are worthy of public commemoration, and I'll talk a little bit at the end of some of the other reasons, and I think more important reasons why it's important to celebrate and commemorate and remember these people and their part in the state's history. Now, throughout Texas, the names of Travis, Bowie, Crockett, Houston, and Austin are prominently on display in the names of streets, schools, cities, and counties. Do you have a Travis school here in town? Do you have a Bowie school here in town? Do you have a Crockett here? Chances are you're going to nod your head once or twice in that list of names, okay? What did any of them have to do with Corpus Christi, however? And so I'm off speech already, see? But my point is this. There's nothing wrong with having schools named for those people, but those are more likely to be the people that when you see a school named for them, you know why the school is named for them. But if you have a school that's named for a local leader, doesn't matter whether he's Anglo, Hispanic, African American, it doesn't matter. You're likely not to know why that school is named for that individual. And yet, that individual probably had a more direct and important role in the development of the Corpus Christi community than Travis or Bowie or Crockett or one of those. So in a way, what I'm saying is that those men are important and we need to learn about them, but we also need to engage that local history. We need to engage those people who had a direct impact on your community. We need to bring kids in schools need to know why the school was named for that individual, what that person's role was in the development of this community. I'll get back on message now. Throughout Texas, these names were prominently displayed on names of streets, schools, cities, counties, and their roles in the creation of modern Texas is well known. By the way, I traveled on Saturday to give a workshop for 7th grade history teachers in Houston, and I came from Austin, all right? So I'm not just talking about here. I went from Austin to Houston. And that is my point today, that it's a bigger picture than that. Today, I'd like to talk to you about men such as Navarro, Ruiz, Beramendi, Musquiz, and Seguin, some of whom have been honored with place names, but who for the most part are forgotten footnotes in Lone Star history. However, these and other prominent members of the Tejano community were as important in their time to the creation of the Republic as any Anglo-American. And unlike the first group of names, they were all natives of Texas, or almost all. I hope that when I'm finished, you will consider that if we are to make the Texas Revolution and Republic relevant to our present school-age population in particular, because that's one of my missions that I have as state historian, is how to advocate for making Texas history more relevant to the children that we have in school today, to make better citizens of them. We need to paint a broader, more inclusive picture of the peoples and events that brought modern Texas into being. First, some definitions, just so you know where I'm coming from during the rest of this presentation. A Tejano is merely a Texan whose ethnicity and cultural heritage are linked to the country we now call Mexico. And for the specific purposes of my talk today, I'll use the term to identify that small community of leading men of public affairs. The subjects of my talks are all males, because at that time and in that place, women, Hispanic and Anglo alike, had no recognized role in public life. And that's also something that we need to remember, that when we're telling this history, we're also, even when we're more inclusive, we're still not inclusive enough, because different stories have to be told in different ways. It's an unfortunate fact that throughout the period, neither in Mexico nor the United States, women could hold elective office or even vote. Likewise, the large percentage of Tejano population was for all intents and purposes excluded from active participation in public life, considered too ignorant to play more than a supporting role in the actions of their leaders. Now, that's a situation that's not so different from the United States, where requisites of wealth and education still lingered as obstacles to full political participation, and where a substantial portion of the population in the southern part of the country was not considered to have any rights whatsoever. And I think that's often something that we forget. We want to judge the Mexican part of the story differently than we're judging the American part of the story. And once we start looking at the commonalities rather than the differences, we see that there's plenty in common, both good and bad, that help us to understand each other, or can help us to understand each other. Now, as far as defining Texas, on the eve of its War of Independence, it didn't include where we are today, for instance. When I used to drive for vacation to the beaches down here and brought the family, as soon as we crossed the Nueces, I said, hey, we're in Tamaulipas. Or Nuevo Santander, actually, which was the name before Tamaulipas. So this part of Texas was not Texas then. Neither was the area around El Paso or Lubbock. Or there's only about a third of today's Texas was Texas during the period that I will be discussing this morning. But as in the case of the United States, where it was only that portion east of the Appalachians that was the United States when it became the United States, and the rest of the country joined in, the rest of Texas joined in being part of Texas. So it's a complicated story. It's not a simple one, but it's a fascinating one, and it's one that can be made relevant to children once they see themselves as part of that story. And that's the important thing, that children need to see themselves in the story, and they can see themselves in the story once people like them are being included in the story. It's not about others, it's about themselves. I make these clarifications to point out that when we speak of Texas in the War of Independence period, we're really only talking of today's state from Goliad and San Antonio to the south and west to San Augustine and the Red River to the north. Texas went on to claim the Rio Grande as its boundary based on some rather dubious evidence that would require a whole separate lecture, so you can invite me here next year and I'll talk to you about that. But the bottom line is that the Mexican War of 1846-48, in which the U.S. defeated Mexico, created today's modern state, and therefore the reason why we can discuss this early history here in Corpus Christi with a great deal of meaning. The events that began in 1821 ultimately lead to Corpus Christi being part of Texas. In this story, the role of Tejanos has largely been marginalized. Although central to the turn of events, although central to the turn of events. True, there were not many Tejanos, but small numbers does not necessarily mean small influence. Tejanos were instrumental in shaping Texas history, but as a decreasing proportion of the population throughout the 19th century, their role almost completely disappeared at the hands of triumphalist Anglo-American writers, especially those who came after Frederick Jackson Turner. So let me explain what I mean. In 1821, there were approximately 3,000 Tejanos, although the population had been nearly twice as large in 1800, at the onset of the Mexican War of Independence, which reached Texas twice and devastated the province. Tejanos who sided with the insurgents in 1813 were killed or fled to Louisiana or Indian-controlled areas. Among these were Juan Martín Beramendi, who was the son of a Spanish immigrant to Texas, and who would go on to serve as interim governor of Coahuila, Texas in 1832-33 until he died in a cholera epidemic that was sweeping the southern United States and Mexico. Another Mexican War of Independence exile was Jose Francisco Ruiz, who would go on to serve as an Indian agent and later sign the Texas Declaration of Independence with his nephew, Jose Antonio Navarro, who was himself the son of a Corsican immigrant to Texas. Others saw their livelihoods entirely destroyed and retreated to other parts of Mexico. Erasmo Seguin, who was the great-grandson of one of the earliest San Antonio settlers, was accused of treason by the crown, lost all his property, and was forced to take his family, including his son Juan, who I'll come back to in a little while, to live in the interior of Mexico for a number of years. There was Juan Antonio Padilla, a native of Coahuila, who would later side with the Texans in their struggles against the national government. Nacogdoches was almost entirely deserted during the Mexican War of Independence, and other recently established settlements were abandoned in the face of Indian attack, floods, and neglect. Spanish control of Texas extended little beyond the immediate confines of the city of San Antonio and the Presidio community at La Bahia, today's Goliad. As Ignacio Perez, another native-born Texan who served as the first native-born governor of Texas in the 18-teens, protested to his superiors when support, when help, when aid failed to reach Texas. Under such circumstances, Tejanos faced a variety of problems at Mexican independence. First, they faced chronic Indian warfare without adequate military support from the national government, a situation they felt went well back into the 18th century and which prevented safe movement even in the immediate area surrounding the communities that did exist. Second, they faced economic disaster. The Spanish government had been unable to pay the garrisons at San Antonio and La Bahia with any regularity, so that soldiers and their families were destitute, with obvious consequences for the merchants, farmers, and artisans who depended on military payrolls for their business and the soldiers' service for protection. Not surprisingly, soldiers were increasingly involved in criminal activity on the one hand, and on the other hand were unequipped to carry out their duties. Without safe conditions or economic activity beyond the subsistence level, there was little chance of population growth, particularly on the part of people of means who were unwilling to take the risks involved in establishing themselves on a hostile Indian frontier. Newly independent Mexico appeared ill-equipped to meet the needs of far-off and unproductive Texas. Mexico had lost over 1 million people to the War of Independence, 1 million deaths during the war, out of a population of about 8 million. All right? 75% of the mines had ceased functioning through deliberate destruction, flooding, the collapse from inattention, and the unavailability of labor. Similarly, agricultural land went barren for lack of labor. The tax system relied almost exclusively on import and export tariffs, an inadequate funding situation even if corruption and waste were not rampant, and a healthy chunk of available funds weren't being spent on a bloated military. Although Texas representatives to the national congresses in 1822 through 1824 were gladdened by the political autonomy and new social compact that independence had produced, they were sobered by the knowledge that the national government could do little on its own to improve the lot of Texas and Tejanos. Texas's first representative in Mexico City was San Antonio native and parish priest Refugio de la Garza. He wrote home that the divisions among Mexicans based on race and status had ended. In his most optimistic letter, he wrote, quote, "To repeat what I have written in my previous letters, arbitrariness is ended, as are oppression, despotism, and tyranny. Today, Texas enjoys unlimited freedom, without obstacles or hindrances, may dispose of everything which prodigal nature has bestowed upon it, land and sea, without regard to any laws other than those which the province may itself liberally impose." In other words, right after independence, there are lots and lots of very bad problems, but there's also optimism. And Tejanos feel that they have the future in their hands. Of course, the reality was very different, and Texas's representative to the Second Constitutional Congress, Erasmo Seguin, struggled to find a place for Texas in the emerging federal nation state. In the spring of 1824, Seguin managed to reach an alliance with Coahuila, Texas's poor neighbor to the south, in order to avoid becoming a federal territory. He saw what all the problems the federal government had in Mexico City. He realized that Mexico City could never pay attention to Texas adequately, so he looked around for another Mexican state that would be willing to partner with Texas. The only other state willing to partner with Texas was Coahuila. Now, Texas was the poorest part of the Mexican nation at independence. Coahuila was the second poorest. So you can see that that alliance is going to be a very difficult one to put off, one that eventually, in fact, isn't successful. But at least union with Coahuila promised greater local autonomy for Texas. As Seguin wrote home, he had been forced to, quote, go about begging for refuge, and as the Saltilleros, that's what they call the people from Saltillo and Coahuila, are the most determined, they are predisposed to protect and help us, up to a point. This is a solution which appears to me we should adopt, although it brings us little advantage, for they can give us nothing, rather than be given the status of territory. It was the least bad of the scenarios that confronted Seguin, but it would prove to be an unworkable marriage. In the meantime, Tejanos sought solutions to Texas's ills elsewhere. Pregnant pause. In stepped the Americans. Already on the eve of Mexican independence, Moses Austin had come to San Antonio to ask for permission to establish a colony of Roman Catholic Americans for whom he would serve as agent. Like his biblical namesake, Moses Austin was destined not to enter the promised land with his people, a task that fell to his son Stephen, who soon changed his name to Esteban in order to fit in. He also learned Spanish, sent his brother Brown to live with the Seguins in San Antonio so that he might learn the language and customs of the people with whom he would be working for the rest of his life. Stephen Austin also set about establishing good working relations with other Tejanos. Instrumental to the success of Austin's early colony was Jose Antonio Saucedo, a longtime public figure who was serving as chief administrative officer of Texas in the 1823-25 period, when Austin was getting himself organized. It was Saucedo who kept Austin within the law and offered advice on how to establish rules for his colony. Although Austin employed as his first land commissioner the Baron of Bastrop, a Dutch emigre who had established himself in Louisiana until the purchase and then moved to Texas, he later employed the services of San Antonio businessmen Gaspar Flores and Miguel Arciniega. He later worked closely with political chief Ramon Musquiz, another native of Coahuila, who was attempting to establish his economic interests in Texas. Soon, other Anglo-Americans seeking opportunities in Texas joined Austin in the land speculation business. Texas was about land, and Tejanos understood that Anglo-Americans had access to the labor, the capital, and the business contacts necessary to bring about development. Francisco Ruiz famously wrote that, quote, I cannot help seeing advantages which, to my way of thinking, would result if we admitted honest, hard-working people, regardless of what country they came from, even hell itself. Of course, the devils were the Anglo-Americans, who were already beginning to raise suspicions, especially on the increasingly contentious issues of land and slaves. With few people and lots of land, the first order of business for Tejanos was to get the land settled and the Indian frontier defended. Anglo-Americans brought an uncompromising attitude toward native peoples that promised to solve the long-running problem of insecurity for Hispanic communities. Tejanos did not have the resources to defeat Apaches, Comanches, and other aggressive autonomous tribes. The Anglo-Americans did. There were not enough Tejanos or migrants from the interior of Mexico to cultivate Texas commercially, but Anglo-Americans were hell-bent on exploiting international cotton demand by expanding production everywhere possible. Tejanos saw incoming cotton interests, people whom they referred to as capitalists, because they had access to financial resources unavailable to Mexicans, as exactly what Texas needed. Never mind that they brought slaves to a country that had renounced human bondage. At every turn, then, the vast majority of Tejano leaders favored, promoted, encouraged, and defended Anglo-American immigration because they generally backed a policy strong on local autonomy and states' rights. Favored by advocates of strong federal system in Mexico, they have come to be known as the Federalists. Not to be confused with the American Federalists, who were men that followed Alexander Hamilton and James Madison in support of a strong central government in the United States. The people who support the strong central government in Mexico are going to be called Centralists, which makes it easy to remember the distinction. At the state congress in Saltillo and later when it moved to Monclova, Federalists such as Jose Antonio Navarro defended the practice of slavery in Texas as necessary to economic development. Properly regulated under more humane Spanish-Mexican laws, slaves in Texas could serve the interests of development. When the state legislature opted for emancipation, it was the Tejano delegates who presented Austin's plan to allow the practice of indentured servitude. By this ruse, slave owners would manumit their slaves on paper before crossing into Texas on condition that the free men paid for their freedom with 99 years of labor. For a while, it kept the doors open to Anglo-American immigration. When the law of April 6, 1830 threatened to stop almost all immigration from the United States, Tejanos such as political chief Ramon Musquiz and Texas representatives to the legislature Rafael Antonio Manchola and Jose Maria Balmaceda raised such complaints that Balmaceda was expelled from the legislature and Manchola was censured. There were some Tejanos who were actively engaged in establishing new communities and economic activities. Martín de León, the only Tejano empresario, founded the town of Victoria, and until his death in the cholera epidemic of 1833, attempted to establish good working relations with American and European immigrants settling along the coastal region. His son Fernando and his son-in-law Plácido Benavides continued their warm relations with the Anglos and identified themselves with the Tejano Federalists. Just to the south in the Goliad area, Carlos de la Garza, a member of an old Presidio family, established one of the largest ranching communities in the region. He counted among his friends the various Irish and Anglo families that moved into the area in the early 1830s. As my remarks make obvious, Texas did not lack for Hispanic leadership. And I might argue that without that leadership, Anglo-American immigration might well have gone far more slowly. Who knows what might have resulted from a course of events in which Anglo-Americans did not participate in the development of Texas in the 1820s and 1830s. Nevertheless, it would be wrong of me not to take note that there were voices of caution, if not outright hostility, to the direction of developments in Texas. Some Tejanos began to see the growing flood of Anglo-American immigration, unmatched by a similar Mexican migration, as potentially dangerous. Jose Maria Balmaceda, who had previously supported immigration from the United States, by the spring of 1833 was writing, quote, "The political situation of the Mexican part of Texas is very difficult and compromised at present, and we all wonder very much that the state's authorities have not dictated some measure to preserve even the appearance of the laws and respect for the authorities entrusted with enforcing them." In 1831 through 33, Tejanos were still much farther away from rebellion than the growing Anglo-American population, which had less and less reason to conform to Mexican practices. Although they had taken an oath to be good Mexicans, Anglo settlers, in the absence of Tejano neighbors or Mexican authorities, recreated Southern society in Texas. Beyond the Tejano zone along the San Antonio and Lower Guadalupe rivers, Anglo-Texas communities increasingly resembled places in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. Whites ran their affairs in English, and blacks, although technically free, were treated as slaves, with little thought to the fact that they lived in Mexico. In 1834, an inspector from the national government, Juan N. Almonte, wrote that the Anglo-Americans all carried in their back pockets a copy of the Constitution of the U.S., as if it were the law of the land. Without a counterweight to this flood of immigrants, which had reduced the Tejano population to 1/5 of the province's total, Texas was lost. Nevertheless, Tejanos openly advocated the cause of Anglo-American interests and the need to find a way of stabilizing Mexican politics. As the political situation in Mexico deteriorated in 1834 and 35, Tejanos faced increasingly difficult choices. Juan Seguin, who had assumed the office of political chief in January 1834, had to announce the news that Stephen Austin had been arrested and taken to Mexico City under charges of sedition. Later in the year, he attempted to call a convention in San Antonio of representatives from all of the municipalities of Texas to decide on a course of action, given the fighting that had erupted between Federalists and the supporters of Antonio López de Santa Anna's reactionary takeover of the national government. If the Federalists represented the promoters and defenders of states' rights, the promoters of a strong national government in which the rights and privileges of the military and the church were preserved, were called Centralists. Centralists had turned to Santa Anna to overthrow the increasingly and radically reform-minded work of acting President Valentin Gómez Farías. And the struggle between Federalists and Centralists had thrown much of the country into chaos. So, what we have here, and what you have to remember, is all of these events. The settlement of Texas by Anglo-Americans, the struggle between Federalists and Centralists, are all taking place within the first 15 years of the independence of Mexico. Mexico becomes independent in 1821. The Texas Revolution begins in 1835. Think about what goes on in the United States between the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the adoption of the Constitution in 1789. A period of political instability where the first form of government, the Articles of Confederation, proved to be unworkable. George Washington has to step up to the plate and tell his fellow officers not to overthrow the government. The difference between what happens in the early United States and what happens in early Mexico is that in the United States, nobody stepped over that line of taking up arms to create political change. In Mexico, they did. And that's where the political histories of the two countries diverged. But they started off with the same kind of instability, trying to figure out how to best govern territory that had previously only known allegiance to a foreign monarch. In Coahuila, the Federalists controlled the state legislature, sitting at Monclova, while Centralists in Saltillo called on Mexico City to support their efforts to brand the Monclova government illegal. For Tejanos, these disputes required taking sides, and Seguin saw Texas as naturally in the Federalist camp. A large number of Texians, that is Anglo-American settlers, wanted no part of the Federalist-Centralist struggle. Increasingly, they had come to see Mexican politics as mired in personality disputes, corruption, militarism, and superstition, as they like to call the Catholic Church. As a result, Tejano Federalists found little support among Anglos for their efforts to assist the Federalist cause in Coahuila. Thus, in the fall of 1835, when rebellion broke out in Texas, it may have done so in the Anglo portions of the province, but Tejanos were more than ready to take part for their own reasons. Juan Seguin raised a company of Bejareños to defend Texas against centralist aggression. Plácido Benavides did the same in Goliad. Only in the spring of 1836, when the rebellion against centralist rule turned into a war for independence, did Tejanos have a new choice to make: assume responsibility for their portion of the fight or remain loyal to Mexico, even if to an increasingly despotic government. Most chose the path of independence. José Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz signed the Texas Declaration of Independence along with the Mexican nationalist Lorenzo de Zavala. Juan Seguin and his men fought during the runaway scrape and at San Jacinto, or as they like to say up the road when I was there on Saturday, San Jacinto. Not all Tejanos sided with the cause of independence. Carlos de la Garza organized a company of men loyal to Mexico and assisted General Urrea in his coastal campaign. Nevertheless, Garza was unwilling to see his Texian friends persecuted and lent aid to a number of them. Perhaps because of this, he was unmolested in his property following the war and lived to establish a sizable progeny in the Goliad area. Plácido Benavides, unwilling to cross the line between rebellion against bad government and rejection of Mexico, went home to sit out the rest of the struggle when he found out about the Declaration of Independence. And now, for the part you've been waiting for, the end. In the long run, the problem for Tejanos was that their few numbers, their mixed racial background, their Catholic heritage, and their Spanish language combined to isolate them within a society that had quickly become dominated by Euro-American Protestant English speakers. Because of their Mexican cultural heritage, Tejanos were looked upon as Mexicans, and Mexicans were foreigners and the enemy. The irony is that of the approximately 2,000 men who participated in the Battle of San Jacinto, there were only 20 who had been born in Texas. They all fought on the Texas side. Nevertheless, men such as José Antonio Navarro, Juan Seguin, and Antonio Menchaca made a lasting impression on their fellow Texans. The names of a county and a couple of towns attest to their status. But overall, there was little interest on the part of an increasingly Anglo-American population to remember the significant role that Tejanos had played in fostering immigration and protecting the rights of Americans in Texas. It is left to us today to recover that memory and to make sure that all Texans today and tomorrow appreciate the roles of their Tejano forebears in bringing modern Texas into being. Thank you very much.